Welcome back to Shapes of Grief, everybody. And I'm completely thrilled to be joined today by poet and writer Mary Kennelly. Mary, you're so welcome.
Thanks, Liz.
Mary sent me her book. It's called Into the Grey. It's a new collection of poems about your two uncles. Nobody has ever contacted me before about the grief when an uncle dies. And it made me realize that, similar to sibling loss, it's quite a disenfranchised grief and an unacknowledged grief.
I think it is because in the case of my two uncles, one was a priest, so he didn't have a family. So, what do you do when somebody doesn't have a daughter or a son who is next of kin? Somebody steps in, somebody, is there because there's still a family, and in the case of my other uncle, he had one child who herself was not in a position to look after him. He was divorced, actually. So again, he was also on his own. So what do you do? And they became a very big part of my life as they needed more care.
Yeah. And it sounds like I read the book in its entirety this morning, Mary. And as I said to you before I pressed record, it was responsible for a very wet face in this house this morning. Once I'd sorted out my kids, I actually made a cup of coffee, grabbed your book, which arrived in the post today, and I climbed back under the duvet. And my 15-year-old came in at one stage. She's like, "What's wrong with you?"
Somebody asked me why poetry. Now, I tend to write mainly poetry, but it lends itself, this particular book, because actually I wouldn't recommend anyone do it the way you did it. It is a little bit heavy and oppressive, whereas it lends itself. It's a thing like grief, which needs to be eaten in small bites. And it lends itself to that.
Actually, I didn't find it, maybe that's just me, but I didn't find it heavy or oppressive at all. It was like you completely got the finger and pointed right on the little part of me that has felt all of these things. Actually, this could have been me writing this, except I don't have your eloquence. I've had all of these experiences.
Yeah.
But to see someone else write your lived experience that you've maybe never vocalized with somebody else is amazing. It's like, it's so validating and it's such an acknowledgement. Like I literally used up practically a whole pad of Post-its this morning. And I don't know how we're actually going to manage the next hour because there's so much that I want to talk to you about. And I suppose for me as well, you probably don't know this, but my father died last year in March, and he had dementia. So there's so much that resonated with me.
I'm so struck, Liz. I suppose to say, first of all, when my boys, as I call them, when they were in the nursing home, I stopped writing. And I think that's something to do with the nature of grief, and in particular, the grieving that goes on when you have somebody, whether it's dementia or whether it's another long-term illness that is terminal. When you are walking through a really difficult time, well, there was just no room in me for creative writing. There was no part of me that could stand back and look at it objectively, I just had to live it. And then after Brendan died, Brendan was the second of the two to die, and he died just last October. And suddenly it was like opening the floodgates, and this came out. But I did actually, I worried a little bit about whether, I had two main worries about in writing this. One is, my God, would anyone want to read this? Because, but the second was, I didn't want to feel that I was intruding into the experience that John and Brendan had, that I was betraying their privacy, if you like, because the funny thing about dementia, we do tend to be very protective of our people with dementia. We do tend to I don't know if hide is the right word, but to allow them to fade a little bit into the background so they're not totally exposed as they decline. But I really looked at it and I just said, somebody has to write this, because family after family after family goes through this, and it's silent and it is a little bit hidden. And what I have been so struck by is, we launched it last week, and there were people there crying. I had asked the Minister for Education actually launched it, but John McDonough, who had done the foreword and is a senior lecturer in English in Mary I, and John, I know him for years, and he knew Brendan also. So I thought he would be a good person to come along on the day and speak as well. He didn't talk. I was expecting something academic on the nature of poetry. He talked about his dad who has dementia. My editor talked about his gran who has dementia. So I think it just, like, if it's worth anything, that's the worth of it, is here I am just saying, this is what it was like to love people, in my case, two at the same time, to love someone who has dementia and who's disintegrating in front of you.
It's such a service, Mary, and I think at the heart of everything I do, it's all about the people, the humans, the relationships. And I was teaching a group of GPs one day last year, and it was like, coming across loss and grief in practice, and maybe giving them a little bit of an overview and how grief can affect the body. And I started off with my credentials, and I'm also bereaved. My dad died 3 months ago, and that was the permission for them to also be a human in that moment, and not just a GP, or, like you say, not just an academic, and that's where the magic is. There's so many ways we could do this, and you've written a book of poetry. Can we start right there? And I wanted to ask you, would you read out Into the Grey, the poem, if you'd be willing, and then maybe we could have a chat about it.
I will, of course. So this is called Into the Grey. Until I walked the road, I did not see the ruin, hidden, almost swallowed whole by thorns. No windows, roof, or doors remain, a one-time home, disintegrating stone by stone. You were once my shelter and my rest, but now our bond is frayed by your crumbling mind and bones. I'm increasingly alone and left exposed as you descend ever further into the grey, day by day by day.
Yeah. It brought to mind a friend of mine who brought her parents to Bloom at the weekend. And I said, "Oh, how did your mum get on?" Her mum has Alzheimer's. She said she didn't really notice.
Yeah.
And it's this woman who was her harbour and her rest.
Mm.
And the ambiguous loss of this. They're alive, but they're also not there. The person you knew is not there anymore. Would you speak about that ambiguous loss a little bit, Mary, what it was for you?
Well, I suppose I'll start by saying that the book is divided into a series of sections. Now there are two very tiny sections, but the two main sections, one is called John and one is called Brendan, because there are different forms of dementia, and dementia takes different shapes. For me, John, who was the priest, we were extremely close, and I always knew that when the time came, if he was to die before me, I would be involved in his care. Brendan was it came from left to field. I didn't think I would be involved in his care. He obviously had a life in Dublin. I mean, I'm talking about Brendan Kennelly, the poet, as well. He had his own life in Dublin, and the way in which I realised that these absolute giants of my childhood were getting into trouble was quite different, because with Father John, it was that day by day by day, and suddenly you would almost, and that's why I called it Into the Grey, because the idea of something that would come almost as a gentle cloud in the beginning, which would thicken into a mist where you could hardly see the person after a while. It took a long time with Father John for me, for the people around, to admit what was going on. It took him a long time to admit what was going on. because it was so gradual, because we could pretend for a
Yeah.
while, you know. With Brendan, he was away, and we began to get phone calls saying, why aren't you looking after him? Don't you know he's in trouble? Don't you know he's... And so with Brendan, by the time we got involved in his care, there was no denying. He was still trying to deny, funnily enough. But and that's where a lot of the protection came in. We put safeguards around him to allow him to deny until he was happy to acknowledge.
You talk there about the shock in his eyes as he's looking for words, and it's and I don't remember which poem it was in, but you talk about God, not you too, you know, the sudden shock of, gosh, is this going to happen again? That took you by surprise that he would have dementia.
Well, in fact, it was like the voyage of the damned. It's a scary thing.
And it's not talked about a lot,
no,
Mary.
No, it's not talked about. And like, I assume there must be a genetic component in my family. So I know myself and three other cousins who were very involved in the care of their parents, or I had a cousin who was very involved in John and Brendan's care with me. Sometimes we sit around, and we're all in our 50s now, saying, oh, is this going to happen to us? You know, it's so, I mean, there are so many layers of tragedy and layers of silence in this. And at the center of it all is this person that you're losing. The best way I can put it, I do call them my boys, because they became like children, down to having to hold their hand. And make sure Brendan in particular could be a devil when he wanted, and just make sure that he didn't go off and do something we were all going to end up in jail over. And you know, towards the end, they were like babies in a bed. They were not verbal. They were not able to walk. They were not able to manage movement themselves. They required complete care towards the end. So, and not everybody has that. And I suppose I just want to be careful that my experience isn't going to be everybody's experience.
There's a spectrum of possibilities there. I'm laughing there. There was one poem that did make me laugh out loud. I'm just trying to find it here. When you said you were lucky Brendan wasn't arrested, when you talk about his car, the black shiny car.
That was actually John's car.
Was it?
I just said the most. Yeah, Brendan couldn't drive, which is hilarious because a lot of people will know he did a car ad many, many years ago, but he was not able to drive. So John's one is under a misfortunate car. And actually the reason I wrote this poem is because I suppose I was writing immediately after Brendan had died. John died in August of 2020 and Brendan died in October of 2021. And after John died, I had tried to write, and I wrote some poems, but it wasn't happening, and Brendan was getting sicker. And so I got, taken up with that. And the poems just rushed out because I hadn't been able to grieve for the one with the process of the other. Do you know? I think my grief came in October 2021 for both of them, because that's the time that I could rest, and that's the time that I could say. So one of the problems was, I suppose, I found it hard to remember the nicer things or the funnier things. Yeah. And so I really had to sit down. And one of the funniest things of all is that poor old John bought this lovely car about 2 years before he went into the nursing home, and he crashed that car so many times. And then he gave it to my father, who continued to crash it. Can I just tell you? So anyway, this is called, do you want me to read it for you?
Please do.
Under a misfortunate star. Nothing too big or flashy would have suited you, but you loved it when you bought it, black and shiny and new. And while such a thing may not be possible for a lifeless object such as a car, that poor machine must have been assembled under a most misfortunate star. Was there a wall or a car or a thorny bush that was safe as you drove that car around? Because it wasn't for the want of trying that you didn't mow them down. Did ever a month go by, I wonder, when we didn't hide some scrapes or tape together broken bumpers? And towards the end, did even a week escape? Funny then, how that car got the last laugh in an ending I did not foresee. When your doctor put you off the road, you finally accepted you could no longer live alone.
Thank you. The poem that came before that, Insurmountable, was actually the first one that brought a tear to my eye. And it was when you were describing John trying to get down the stairs and your son stepped in. This boy or young man of few words, and offered his back and gave his great uncle a piggyback down the stairs. There was something about the passage of time or handing over to the next generations, or
yeah, and I think that's I like that poem. Obviously, my son makes it, who's a great big prop, a rugby playing prop, so he had the back for it. But and I'm very tiny. I'm 5'2", and my husband is 6'4", and my boys are all over 6 foot. So there's just me, and then these monsters living in the house. But I think a lot of families, we have to learn ways to make do. So Father John used to come to my house every Sunday, and the boys would go in most Saturdays, or sometimes he would come here Saturday. But he went to my mom's house then during the week for his dinner, and my aunt went to see him every night. So we were hobbling together a system, you know. My house isn't ideal. It's built on a series of levels. There are steps up to it. There are steps within it to the bathroom and things like that. And he just was getting to a stage where we couldn't really manage him. And then Matthew just came up with this idea of how he was going to handle it. And it was just such an organic thing. We weren't, how are we going? Nobody sat down and discussed how we would handle it. And I think with dementia, for a long time, that's how families have to manage. That as the difficulty comes, we just kind of mooch in and try and put something in place. And we keep doing that until we can't do it anymore, I guess. So.
There's another one that resonated. I mean, they all resonated with me at some level. But did you know, and this is a poem that I really could feel you in it, Mary. I don't want to do this poem any disservice by reading it. So I'm going to ask you to please read it again, and maybe we can talk about what's in there. But it's certainly, yeah, it brought up a lot of memories for me as well.
Okay, this is called Did You Know? With that habit of mine for taking charge, did I take too much too soon? If I had known what was right to do, was there more life you could have held? Did you see the struggle in my heart when I upset your calm, not meaning to? Did you know I always tried my best? Did you know that I loved you? And it's a bit, many years ago, I had a friend whose son committed suicide. And I know that what she lived with for years and years was the not knowing and the questions that arise that you can't answer. Dementia is a little bit like that, because there are so, you know, we do our best. We try. And you don't know, because the person is no longer able to tell you. And I suppose the end, and the reason the poem ends the way it does, is whatever about any of the other decisions we took. And with both John and Brendan, we tried to allow them. I mean, I wasn't their daughter, so we tried to allow them to be involved as they could in their decisions for as long as they could be. But a time came, of course, when they were not able to make decisions that were difficult decisions. And I suppose for me, all I want to know is that they understood, both of them understood, that I loved them right to the end.
It's so evident in this collection, I found myself really envious, actually, of the love that so clearly was a two-way or a three-way thing between you and your uncles. As someone who I had so many uncles. I think my mother was the youngest of 9 girls, and I didn't have any relationship really to talk about with any of them. And here you have this incredible, these benevolent beings. You say it somewhere, I'm sure I'll come up to it, but the way you describe them, these benign, caring, wise beings that were there, and you insinuate in one of the poems that you were a wild teen, and that they sort of had your back. Would you speak a little bit about that? Maybe you can tell me which one that is.
I think that's one of John's, and that's John. Certainly John and I would have, I suppose we're just very close from a very young age. He got me.
Reversal.
Reversal. He got me. You know, he understood me as I was growing up, and I think that allowed me to understand him as he was falling apart. I think, you know,
that's all any human longs for, is to be understood, to be seen and understood by someone in the world.
I think so, and I suppose I'll just say that, and I'll read this poem for you in a minute, but I will just say that both of them COVID affected, both of them, and there was such a tragedy for us in terms of, like, when language had failed, I would sing, or I would, you know, just rub their hands, or just, and when that failed, like, I mean, in the first lockdown, we went from the beginning of March to the following, I think October, before we were in a room with them again. And they were different people at that stage. They had advanced so much into the grey at that stage. Anyway, this is called Reversal. When black was white and when black was black and white was white, there was you and me, and there was certainty. I was the only mutable thing reaching for the truth inside my chrysalis, becoming who I was meant to be. To me, you were as constant and as warming as the sun. Your hands tried to hold me steady when I was a child. Your voice sang for me and carried your wisdom when I sought to test everything by running wild. Now that black is white and white is black, the adult me must help you walk and steady you. I hold your hand and rub your back. I chase away your fears. And when you're lost, I try to reach and rescue you. I think about the safest things for us to do and say. I sing and coo and mother you as if you were my own. Now black and white are swirled into the grey. I am the protector, you the vulnerable one. Yeah.
That it's like birth and like death. You know, I remember when my daughter was born, I thought, I don't love you because I don't know you, but boy, would I kill for you. I was the real mammalian, you know.
Yeah.
And then when my father was dying, it was that sense of, you know, I was like a cheetah protecting him and making sure that, you know, everything that was administered was proper and correct, or that nothing that wasn't needed was administered as well. Tell us a little bit about that for you, Mary.
Well, certainly it was. We were very, very fortunate, and I will say that, and that links into the last poem in the book, which is called Thank You, because the book is, and I never had any doubt about this. People say, aren't you very good? And I don't feel that way. I feel that John and Brendan were able to. They would really want to thank both of the care homes that looked after them. It took me a long time to be able to express what was so exceptional about them, but I think I have it now, or a way to try to explain it. I was there with John one day, and the same would have happened with Brendan, and somebody came in, And it was long beyond a time when they were leaving the nursing home or were managing the day-to-day. And I can't remember if it was John or Brendan, but one of the care staff said to me, actually said to John, should we tell Mary that you need to get new vests? And to me, that 100% explains what was so exceptional about the two nursing homes. They saw the dignity of the person when the dignity had almost disappeared. They saw that these people had been adults, had been, both very intelligent, very formidable men in their own ways. And they saw that it wasn't okay to diminish them more than they had already been diminished. And for me, so having that when COVID came was massive, knowing that safely we could trust the people there to hold their hand and to look after them when we couldn't do it. And I understood why we couldn't, but it was incredibly painful. And I think up and down this country, there are people who have gone through that experience now because of COVID, and the sundering and the pain of it. John died during a COVID lockdown. I mean, I went in, gowned up. Bridget and I took turns. My dad and my aunt would come in, but they weren't staying on their own with him. Bridget and I would come in, all gowned up and we hadn't maybe touched him for months before that, and there was such beauty and dignity in the way the nursing home did allow us in and did allow us to touch him as he was dying. And the same with Brendan,
It makes such a difference, and I think there isn't an episode that doesn't go by where I don't reflect on the truth that people can profoundly exacerbate a difficult situation or profoundly ease a difficult situation. And to know that somebody is loving and respecting and caring for our loved ones, it's like they get it. There was something that reminded me actually of a John O'Donoghue poem. I think when you're talking about Brendan, John O'Donoghue's poem is On Grief, and he talks about nobody knows what's been taken from you. But the poem of yours that reminded me, you said it in a very different way. It's called After. It's towards the end of your book. And you said, is it okay if I read that bit quickly?
Absolutely, yeah.
Memories of warmth and wisdom and mischief, but also some shadows make up the man I knew. So different from that other man the world believes it knows. It's like, the world knows the poet, Brendan Kennelly, but your uncle was someone else. Will you tell us?
Somebody different.
For you, somebody different for you.
Yeah, and I think actually, and this is also something which I think you have to live through to really understand. There is a real privilege in being allowed to be part of somebody's end of days or terminal illness. My father-in-law actually died of motor neuron disease. So we had that sense as well, and there was a real privilege. And the funny thing about Father John was a parish priest, and so he would have been quite proper and reserved in his dealings with a lot of people. And he was owned by the public. Even after he retired, he was conscious of playing a role, if you like. He'd been gone from home for a very long time. Brendan belongs to and quite rightly, he wrote his poetry and he gave it to the world and he wanted the world to know it, and he belongs to the world now. But there was such a privilege in it was like getting them returned, if I could put it like that. They were given back to us for the period while they were ill. And they were human beings to us. They weren't, they weren't a poet and a priest. They were John and Brendan. They were my people. And there was a privilege to that, actually, and a real intimacy.
I love that notion of them being given back, because there is a loss with anybody who's anyway in the public eye. it's like, yeah, claims on them in a way. But they came back to family, back to the bosom of family.
Yeah.
You describe a moment where Brendan tells you to fuck off.
I do, because I tell you, Brendan was an awful scamp, which was something that I loved about him. It was when he went silent, it was much more difficult than when he was being a rogue. But anyway, this is called Stop It, and I'll read it for you. I'll say one thing. Brendan had a real difficulty with connections. So he always knew who I was. I got this beautiful smile. I mean, his beautiful smile when I would go to take him for a drive, and he couldn't be taken out enough. I mean, 7 days a week was not enough to go driving. And but I would get the smile, and I would say, "It's Mary." I wouldn't make him guess. I'd say, "Hi, Brendan, it's Mary," and he knew me. And I know he knew he was safe with me, but he didn't actually know how he knew me. So I might have been his niece or his daughter or his mother or his aunt or his sister, or, or just the nice strange lady that came on Saturdays to take him driving, But he came up with, which I thought was hilarious, he came up with his own name for me. And that is what he called me until he couldn't speak anymore. So this is called Stop It. One day you told me to fuck off when I told you to stop it in vain. Then you laughed and did something outrageous just to hear me say stop it again. Some days you indulged me in thinking that I was perhaps getting through, only to let loose with an almighty cracker and I'd throw a stop it at you. And to show me that I would not win as we played out our little game, you smiled when I came on that visit, and Stop It became my new name. That's what he called me. He called me Stop It. And I suppose just to say, Brendan suffered from frontal lobe dementia. I mean, different types of dementia present their own challenges. John had vascular dementia, and so he would drop. It was like an elevator. You could go in some days and he would have dropped and he wouldn't recover from that drop. Brendan had frontal lobe dementia, so if he could think it, he thought it was okay to say it or to do it. Plus, he had that public profile, which I always felt was very tough on him, because anyone else with frontal lobe dementia is allowed the privacy to be as disinhibited as he was. He wasn't, there was a lot of protection that had to go on around Brendan, because I used to be literally terrified that we would end up on the front page of a newspaper sometimes with some of the things he could say or do, But they were different.
Yeah, it's ironic. It reminds me of that movie Iris, is it? Somebody whose whole identity is around how their mind works and how they express that. And then that's where the focus becomes at end of life, the loss of that. My father had vascular dementia as well, so similar to Father John. But I remember one day I had to pick something. I live in Wicklow, and I had to pick something up at the north side of Dublin, and I thought, I'll pick up Dad and just bring him for the drive. And he would rarely get out of the house. So I picked him up in his carer, and he was in really good form, and we had great chats, and we were laughing a lot, and went to IKEA, did a bit of shopping, had dinner. So this is great. I haven't done this, had a normal day with Dad for a whole afternoon. And we're driving home hours later, and he's in flying form. And then he starts telling me about his daughter. I thought, oh, Jesus, who has he thought has been with him all day? And, it wasn't the first time. He used to often think that I was his sister, Jackie, and my aunt. And I'm wondering, do you remember the first time that you realized Brendan or John didn't know who you were?
Brendan had tremendous, it was something, obviously some part of the degeneration in his brain that meant he really struggled with connections. So I would, like, he'd kind of, I'd come and I could see his mouth forming the word Mary for a long time, and then it wasn't you know. And that's when I began to say, hi, Brendan, it's Mary. And it's such a simple thing to do, you know, to just give them what they need to carry on the conversation. And he knew I was Mary. And sometimes I would say, you're my uncle. And we were really fond of each other. We were good friends when you were younger. But then he might, like, we had this, we would drive. We had a kind of a route that we would drive every so often. When I was feeling brave, we went crossing the ferry one day, and that from Kerry to Clare. Now that just was not successful because he couldn't. We had a really smooth crossing, and he really couldn't grasp the fact that he had left the county, and he was, you know. So we learned certain things were successful and certain things weren't. So we actually drove around a circuit of North Kerry through the same villages and that's where we began to script. Actually, it was something that happened a lot. And it became more important as John and Brendan lost their language, having a script that was familiar. So I literally would have the same conversation, sing the same songs, you know, talk about the same people week after week after week, so that, you know, they didn't have to, they knew their place in the script, if I put it like that. But Brendan, we would be driving around and he'd say, so I would have told him I was his niece, and then he'd say, did you know my mother? I'd say, yes, I know your mother. How did you know my mother? Well, she was my grandmother. Was she your grandmother? You know, he'd be amazed at that. Or I remember once, it's kind of funny, we passed my mom and dad's house. I said, your brother Paddy lives in there. And I said, he's my father. And he said, oh yeah. He said, what's his wife like? And I said, well, she's all right, you know. So he said, do you know her? I said, yeah, I do know her. And he said, how do you know her? I said, she's my mother. So he just didn't get connections. So actually, almost with Brendan, it was easier to see where the deficits were. Father John knew me to the end, and actually, I will never forget you know, one of the last times I went in to see him, and he had, you know, that first day when people kind of begin to really slip away and they don't speak anymore. And so I just came in and I just said, hello, Father John. And I just got this little smile, you know. So even though language was beyond him, I choose to believe that he heard my voice, you know. And there's a poem in there called Lies. And actually, we do have to lie to ourselves, or at least, I don't know if it's the truth or the lie. We tell ourselves things that make the tragedy of the loss bearable.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's what gets us through, is making meaning of it and finding meaning that helps us sit with it, sit with the reality of what's happening. I remember my dad a few days before he died, you know, and it looked like he was not going to be talking to us again, you know. And it's one of the last things he said. And I was there, I was with his carer, and I had an appointment, and I was kind of going, well, will I go or not? It was only an hour, but you don't want to leave their side when you know that death is imminent. And I remember the carer just saying to him again, really respectfully, Morris, will I put a sponge on your mouth? Do you like a little bit of water? Neither of us expecting a response, you know. And his mouth just opened and he just said, if you can spare it. And the two of us just looked at each other. He had a wicked sense of humor, and we just burst out laughing. But I do believe, you know, that they're so present until they're not. You know?
Absolutely, Brendan. Now, thanks be to God, the last thing he said to me wasn't the last thing. The second last thing he said to me was not the last thing he said to me, because it was a cracker. But then, you know, we'll say, I think he died on Sunday, and probably on the Tuesday or the Wednesday, I was with him, and he opened his eyes and he saw it. Now, I really don't know if it was me he saw, because he did say, just come here, and his voice seemed filled with wonder. But by Thursday, he had definitely stopped speaking, and I thought, that is it. And on Thursday, I was doing what I used to do with Father John. I used to just sit and read, and I was doing the same with Brendan. With John, I used to read the Gospel of John because he loved it. With Brendan, I was reading some of his own poems and some of my poems, just poetry for him, because he'd always loved poetry. And suddenly this hand reached out and just grabbed mine so hard and so present, and he just held my hand really firmly for about, I don't know, 20-30 minutes. I don't know how long it was, but I was so shocked because I thought all of that was done and finished, So I suppose that's part of what we don't know with the grey.
Yeah. Yeah. You wrote about that. Would you read that poem out, Mary?
I will if I can find it. Communication.
Yeah.
The next to last time you spoke to me, you used rough words to tell me to be gone. The last time that you spoke to me, you were in your second day of travelling on. You opened your eyes and seemed amazed that I was there. Come here, you said, and so I stood beside your head. I rubbed your hair and kissed your cheeks and brow. Then you settled down and slipped back into the grey. 2 days before you died, all your words were gone. I sat by your bed. I sang, I prayed, I read. I was lost in the words of some poem or another, when your hand, which I'd thought would move no more, slid across the bed and fastened onto mine. For an hour, you held my hand so firmly that your fingers marked my skin. Then you let go and pulled away again.
Who was Brendan for you, Mary?
Brendan was a butterfly, actually, for me. He was, my memory of Brendan as a child is his outrageousness, his intelligence and his outrageousness. He was a really fun uncle. He was, he really was. He would curse at people that we regarded as very stern and severe, and he would make, like my maternal grandfather, I hardly ever saw him laugh. Brendan could make him throw his head back and belly laugh. And then I suppose as I grew older, I became conscious of the public Brendan and his writing. But it was very much, our relationship was still rooted in the child and the adult. It was really when I was in my 30s or so, we began to work together on various different things. And then that sparked a completely new relationship. And that was a very nice relationship because it was, it was a relationship of two people. It was in our arts. I ran the I was involved. I was the artistic director with the Kennelly Summer Festival for a number of years, or would have been involved in different things. He would have given certain advice to me when I started writing, which I think is good advice, even still. Sometimes I would say Brendan depresses me because I'll read, especially if I go to an event where people are reading some of Brendan's older poems or poems I haven't read in a very long time. I think, oh my God, why do I waste my time? He said it all before me, and he said it so much better than I can say it. And then he was somebody who needed care. And literally, and he was somebody who needed care maybe at a time that I wasn't as free with my care. I didn't, I already had John. I was working full time. I had my own kids. I'd been helping to look after my father-in-law, and then my mother-in-law, and then my husband had a foster uncle. So I mean, I was quite involved with other people. And when Brendan came, first of all, I didn't foresee how involved I would be. but what are you going to do? He was my uncle,
Mm.
and I loved him. And but those 5 years when he was down, now I look back and I see how precious they were, and I see that we got to build yet another relationship in that time.
Mm. And like that's quite a burden of care you had on your shoulders. And in one of the poems for today, you say, look at the two of us, it's little enough, but we don't ask for more. And it's like, that's the last line, it's like this shrunken world that can happen when
Yeah.
we're caring for other people. Um, the world and society can feel so far away. How did you cope, Mary? How was your mental health through all of this giving to other people? And
It was not easy, I would say that. And certainly by the time Brendan was dying, I remember being on the phone to a cousin who was very involved, who did probably more with Brendan, definitely more with Brendan than I was doing, but we were great support to each other. I have another cousin who's looking after her father who has dementia. And we were really a club, you know, we did help each other. We understood the pain of what was going on. And it was wonderful in that way. But I mean, I remember talking to Bridget and saying, I don't know how much longer I can do this. I don't know, you know. And there was that sense with both of them. I always say about Jana and Brendan, they weren't lucky enough to die from anything else. In actual fact, they died from dementia, which was not a nice way to go. And a lot of people are spared that because something else will kick in, you know.
yeah,
And they had both had very bad hearts, so we had kind of hoped that maybe the hearts would give out, or they weren't lucky enough to die from anything else other than dementia, which is very slow and wasting and withering, and the lighter moments fade away, and it gets to the point where it's really hard. Um, and I suppose I won't say that I found it easy. I know a time came for both of them when I just, in so much as I prayed, I just said, can they just go, please? Can this be enough? And I would feel guilty feeling that way. But I wasn't just talking about for me. I was looking at what I was doing to my dad, to my aunt. I was looking at what it was doing to myself and my cousin. I was looking at what it was doing to Brendan and to John. And certainly for both of them, a time came when I thought, this is enough. Can this be enough, please?
yeah,
Can this end? And so it's a really funny thing when you grieve for somebody like that. And I know I addressed it in some of the poems there, that in actual fact, how could you be grieving for somebody that it's such a release that they're not here anymore,
yeah,
that you couldn't wish they would be here anymore? So you're not grieving for the physical presence of them, you grieve for the emotional presence of them.
yeah.
That's the best way that I can put it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you actually, you write about that, about the guilt of, essentially wishing that they would die
Yeah.
before they do. An act of love, really. But I think so much of our society today, it's about prolonging life. But as I say often in podcasts, we prolong death in most cases.
Yeah.
Like we're not prolonging life,
Yeah.
we're prolonging dying. For what? And
Yeah.
sometimes that's really important. If there's young mothers that want to make more memories with their children, and they will buy 3 more months if they can, even though it's painful or difficult. But that's not always the case either. Like sometimes we just prolong death, and it can be cruel in some
Yeah.
cases.
I know with Father John, and it's just such a strong memory, and it's such a painful memory for me. He had now, you know, we did whatever we had to do. We went to the courts and things to sort it with Brendan, but he'd had his pacemaker battery replaced about a year before he died, or a year or two, and that's what I remember. I remember him being essentially dead, and this metronome beating in his chest, and the everybody just looking realizing that this was such an unnecessary cruelty to put him through, So I do feel that there is a discussion that we have to have at some point when we're mature enough to have it, I guess, around and I very much see, for me, there are differences between actively ending somebody's life and unnecessarily prolonging somebody's life. They're two very different things.
Yeah, 100%. When he got his pacemaker when he was very, very ill and dying. You said a year before he died. But...
Yeah, he had his battery replaced in his pacemaker.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Do you know? And like I found it traumatic. I'll be like, that is one of the big memories of that last week, and certainly the last few days, is just watching and just saying, he was gone. We knew he was gone. In other ways, he had, he was breaking down and things like that. But watching this metronome beating, which wasn't his heart in actual fact, which was this battery, and thinking, how long can a battery keep going when there's nothing else there? Do you know?
And you think it was the battery that kept going?
There's no question or doubt in my mind. Now, and, I'm not a medic, but he was gone, or he was gone beyond where it was right for him not to be gone, where it was, and I suppose for me, when I look at death, I think something organic does happen. I don't know how to put this into words, and I'm not here to evangelize or anything like that, but you witness, when you're privileged enough to be with people who are dying, some process happening. And for me, it feels like they move on, or they make a conscious choice at some point, or and I feel that Father John's process was interfered with just by that fact, not maliciously on anybody's part, not, but I think, like, when are we going to be mature enough to discuss whether or not, and I know I would be so clear, my poor children are quite, they grew up, if you like, listening to me saying, you better not do that to me. You better, I don't want this. So we grew up, like, my kids as teenagers listened to their mom, and I don't know how good or bad that is, but sitting around the kitchen table saying, don't do that to me. I don't want that.
I'm curious, Mary, because one of the last things I Googled while Dad was alive was, can a pacemaker keep your heart beating when you're dead? I actually Googled that on March 6th in the morning, which was hours before he died. And like that, I've seen a few people die. I've been privileged to be at a friend and my mother's bed when they were dying by their side. But with Dad, it was just like that. It was like he was dead. He was like a corpse, almost like rigor mortis had set in, and just this heart beating like a mechanic. And I was like, Jesus, is there a battery we need to take out here? Because literally that is what it looked like. And a friend of mine, she's Dr. Catherine Mannix, she's been on the podcast a few times. She'd been texting me, just checking in. And I remember texting her that morning going, Catherine, is there a switch? Tell me, is there a switch? And it was, I had spent 3 weeks there, so present to him and with him and by his side. And so similar to what you described, Mary, kissing him and stroking his forehead and stroking his hair. But on that day, I was just like, I just want to put a pillow over him. This is so prolonged, and is this natural? This doesn't feel right. And so I don't know. I mean, if anyone's listening, I don't know if medically it's possible or not, but it's curious that we both had that same feeling.
And I will say one thing, it is so difficult, actually, just to touch back on something you mentioned, which is when a niece or a nephew find themselves looking after. There was no question. Father John had fallen a number of times and ended up in A&E and things like that, and I would have been very upset by how he was treated, by how a very vulnerable man with dementia was treated in A&E at different times. And I remember discussing with the nursing home, going and saying, look, if you think he has broken a bone, okay, call me and I'll meet him in A&E. But other than that, put him in his bed and make him comfortable, and don't put him through this if it's. And because it was obvious in one way that I was, and my aunt was with me actually when we had the discussion with them, and they knew we were the people looking after him, and they were very respectful around that. But it's a really grey area actually for nieces and nephews. I wasn't his next of kin. I wasn't his daughter. I wasn't, and it can be really hard trying to make those difficult decisions around care and around those kinds of things. Should a pacemaker battery be replaced, for example? Does a family member have a right to say, no, I don't believe you'd have wanted that? And I think there's a massive discussion. Probably you asked me, how am I affected mentally? Well, definitely one of the ways I'm affected is that I think everyone of my age and should be looking at the thinking ahead document and filling it out and writing very clearly, so that when their children are in that situation, that they don't have to second guess.
Is this the Think Ahead program from the
Think
Irish
Ahead,
Hospice Foundation?
Yeah. And I think it's a wonderful document. I don't know what legal status it holds, but I think if you had it in a nursing home or in a hospital, and if you're an obvious next of kin, and you can say, look, that's her handwriting. This is what she wanted or he wanted. And I think we should all be doing it, because unfortunately, medical science, I think, has maybe outstripped our ability to just easily let go. And when I hear of very elderly people getting aggressive chemo or getting, it's really hard. I understand that position doctors and nurses are in. I very much understand the position carers are in. And so I think we need to have a discussion around how we can do death a little bit better in those circumstances.
Yeah, for sure. You consciously turned towards your two uncles and stepped into care for them. What was that like personally? I mean, you say there you had a father-in-law who was ill, you've got 3 children, you're working. Something in you consciously or unconsciously, I don't know, turned towards these men and decided, I'm going to be available for them.
The process was different for both. As I say, with Father John, there was never a question. Like, we had been extremely close always, and he really was. He was like another father to me, really. We were close. I was his favourite. He had no bones about letting the world know I was his favourite. It's very hard not to love somebody who lets everybody know you are their favourite. And with Brendan, it was a more gradual process. Did it cost something? Yeah, it did cost something. It did. And caring for all of the people that I have cared for in my life has cost something. But I suppose it wasn't something I could say no to. I'm not making, I'm not an angel here. And there were lots of days that I was tired and cranky, and sometimes there were weeks and I was just, I cannot do it this week. I just can't. I need to take a week off here.
It's so important to say, because we'd be doing such a disservice to people listening who are, on their knees caring for someone.
Yeah.
It would be a disservice to make it look like it's this beautiful thing that you go through with someone you love, and then you produce a book of poetry at the end of it.
And I think that's a great expression, on your knees. I felt on my knees for long periods of time, and I was desperate for it to end and to be over. And I did wonder, and I say that loving the 2 men involved, but it was horrendously painful for everyone involved. Horrendously painful. And so I produced this book of poetry, maybe because I think I wrote the book of poetry because I wasn't going to be able to write anything else until this was done. This is my catharsis. This is my way of dealing with it. I might have published it for different reasons, but I wrote it out of compulsion, really, you know, as my way of sorting things out.
You said in one of the poems, it's like you had no memory of the other versions of them in the midst of the grief. And I think that's so true. It's like we have to really process the death and the loss and the dying and the anticipatory grief, all of those things, to be able to then access the whole person. And I remember for me, and I did, this didn't quite seem to happen for you, but it also kind of did. I can see a process for you through the book. But for me, like, I was really close to my dad, you know, and he was fun and he was my go-to person. And he wasn't really wise like your uncle, so I'm totally jealous of that. But he was there, and he would be present, and he cared, and he was loving, and he'd follow up, even if he didn't have amazing words of wisdom, or even if he did, I wouldn't have listened. But I lost that bit by bit, you know, over maybe a 5-6 year period, to the point that it was so gradual. It was like this gradual thing melting away, that I had forgotten. And it was only when he died, and then, say, school friends or people I haven't been in touch with for a few years reflected to me what he meant to me. They were like, oh my God, your dad, I'm so sorry. I know he meant the world to you. And he was always in your house. You're always so close. And it was like this flood came back. I got him back in death. I got that back, you know. Would you speak to that? Because you've written a little bit about that. I had a question for you, and then I read your poem on it.
Yeah, I mean, I have. There were two things I'll speak to about that. The first is that I found it desperately painful during the process. Again, because the two boys had been public to different degrees. I mean, in many ways, in Kerry, Father John was better known than Brendan, because he had been a parish priest in so many parishes. But because they were public, sometimes out of tremendous kindness, people would come and say, oh, I found this picture, or oh, I found. It was excoriatingly painful. There was no other way for me to do what I was doing except put my head down, look at my feet, and take one step at a time. I mean, I just existed day by day. And I mean, there are poems in there about I didn't know who I'd find each day, about having to just accept, you know, that poem that you referenced, look at the two of us, it's little enough, but it's enough, you know, having to accept that. But the other thing is, and here, this is a little bit unique. I mean, the day that Brendan died, Bridget and I were in the car just after he died. My mom and dad had come in, and her mom had come in. They were in the room with him, and we were sitting in the car. Now, we had known that he was dying, and we had like a mass kind of hammered out, and we had all those practical things, because we knew we had to do, you know, we were so much more organized the second time than the first time. But, you know, and suddenly we remembered or realized, because he had shrunk, he was very tiny when he died, that we didn't have a shirt. And where would we going to get a shirt? And we were kind of discussing where we're going to, who's had a child that would have a white shirt that might fit Brendan, and because he died on a Sunday. And but the phone rang, and it was Pascal Sheehy. It was such a bizarre thing, you know. So we're discussing the absolute mundane things that every family has to discuss, and then there's RTE looking for a comment, you know. And the first thing that came into my head was, how in the name of God do they know? We're still trying to make sure everybody in the family knew. But and then that night, or that evening, when everybody's gone, I just went back down to the room, and I spent a little bit of time with him. And he was, as I say, very tiny. And then I went home, and there was a clip on the RTE News of him. Oh, his beautiful big round face, and his massive laugh, and the head thrown back, and I had no way to recognize one from the other. There was a complete disconnect. I did not recognize the man. so much had been taken in such a gradual chipping away. I didn't know who the man, he was a stranger. He was not the man I had left that day. And I think that's something that happens with dementia. And I think part of the healing that happens with dementia, part of the way you know you're healing, is when you can actually look again at the happier times and remember again the happier people and the, in my case, the giants that I had known.
Yeah. And it's so much of what you describe, Mary, it resonates so deeply, that bird-like creature in the bed, you know, like that. My father was a rugby player in his day, and the here, and you know, this doesn't happen for everyone, but this is such a part of life. And you know, you mentioned that in your book as well, that this is, we don't reduce them to how they died or how they are, how we are when we die. It's a chapter or a line in a poem, you know.
Yeah.
What are your words? What words did you put on that? Do you know the one I'm referencing?
I do, and I'm pretty sure it's called After, isn't it? No, Hindsight.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want me to read that one for you?
That's the last one, please do. Yeah.
Yeah. Tied up and blinded as I was in the decay of your last years and months and days, I had forgotten the you were before. In those first days and weeks of after, I was caught off guard by the shards of sound and story of the younger you. They clashed with the raw reality of the men I'd said my goodbyes to. It took a while, but slowly I began to reconcile the older and the younger man. And then such a swell of pride came sweeping in for all the things that you had said and done. And love, yes, I suppose we'll call it that. My feelings not tamed, but tempered by knowing the road on which you'd gone.
Beautiful. Mary, there's one called Loss, where you write about somebody grieving in the third person.
That's actually my aunt, and she and Brendan were exceptionally close. And she just, I think we all of us hit a wall at some point. We all of us hit a day that we just felt we couldn't go on. So this was her day. On that day, the laughter would not come. There was no chink through which it could seep in, leaving her alone and shivering in stark reality. Her tears and tears and tears came then. She cried for all that had been taken. She cried for all that had been lost. She cried because death was all that could be wished for, now that living carried such an unbearable cost.
Is there anything that surprised you about grief? After you said that after Brendan died, you finally grieved both men. And I think it's important to say that actually, the last guest that I just interviewed as well has said something similar. Her daughter died, and in the aftermath, she's been so ill that she hasn't had a chance to properly grieve her daughter 4 years later. And this is quite common, you know, that often we're getting through, if there's distractions or other things going on, we don't all have the luxury of being able to grieve well, whatever that might look like. So you were saying I think the grief for both of them came.
Oh, absolutely. And I should say that I became ill, actually. I became quite ill, and amn't working now because I still am just managing an illness that I developed while I was minding them, you know. And I think sometimes when the grief is so profound, I think our body pays the price.
Oh, yeah.
Because our mind sometimes can't go there. I don't know if that is the case, but I think it does. happen.
Well, we don't process grief through our mind.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, I
we
think
are
we,
mammals, you know,
yeah,
we're
yeah,
mammals.
and
We
I
love,
think our
we
body
attach.
does
Yeah,
pay a price, you
yeah.
know, and there is a price to be paid. And I know there's another poem in there, which I wrote for Father John, and it's literally just acknowledging. And I think this is true about grief, and this is something I have learned. We are entirely different from the person we have been before.
I'm
We,
looking for that. Yeah, the
so
word you use is I'm altered. Isn't that the
I'm
word you
altered.
use?
Yes, that's correct.
I
Yeah,
took a note of that.
and we are very much. It's called here.
Here, page
Here,
41.
yeah. Our always and our everything have led me on to here. Our story, twisting and soaring, tragic and serene. Because there was an us, I will be different as I travel on. Since the grey, without a sliver of mercy, came to call and took our everything away, I am different now, less certain, my tethers less secure. From the outside, I don't think it can be known how I am recast by all that you and I went through, how you were always here inside me, how I have been made anew. And I think that is what I have learned about grief. That and the fact that people that we do a lot of talking about grief as a society, and we are intolerant. I think there's a sell-by date on grief. Years ago, I wrote a poem called Humpty Dumpty for my aunt, who kind of fell apart when her husband died. And people understand it for a while, and then they're like, come on, pull yourself together. And I think each time we go through, we're tempered in that way, are tested in that way. We are just different people. There is no going back to who we are before we knew that level of grief.
Yeah, definitely. And I said altered, but the word you used was recast.
Recast.
Somehow
recast,
I kept
yeah.
altered in my head.
Yeah.
Yeah, that it's we, you know, the people think that grief is a process we go through with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then we're back to normal. But when we have a profound loss, it does alter us. We have to change to accommodate our loss. We have to grow, fall apart, break open, whatever way we do it, to be able to find space for that grief inside us. Because our person is never undead, you know.
No.
But there's something there. There's something there you say, Mary. I'm different now, less certain. My tether's less secure. And it's so incredible, because it is like, I study grief, right? I'm a grief trainer, a grief educator. I have a master's in bereavement studies. You know, I've studied the great John Bowlby and attachment style. And you are saying all the same stuff, just in the language of poetry, you know. It's, you know, the attachment theory is that the Bowlby and John Murray Parks noticed that toddlers, when they're pulled away from their caregiver, their mother, have this, they're untethered. They're, you know, they cry, they want them back. I need them to feel okay again. And they notice that people who are grieving, it makes sense, have a similar attachment. And when someone we love is pulled away, we just want them back. We're untethered, you know. And these attachments, these relationships regulate us. And you grew up in this family of, I don't know how many thousand people are in your close family, but it's something that's taken so for granted when you're in it, just that these people are there like the trees. And it's only when the trees begin to fall do we start to feel the nakedness maybe of our own being on the world. And would you speak a little bit about that, these great trees falling around you?
Actually, it's such a nice phrase to use. My father-in-law, who I was really fond of, used to say the shelter belt is getting thin. That's how he was one of a big family. And when, as his brothers and sisters began to die, he said, my shelter belt is getting thin. And for me, that's kind of what it's like. And I don't think it necessarily needs to be family. I think as humans, we seek connection and we create our own forests, if you like. You know, we and as we part with those people, certain things happen as the outer trees grow thin, we become the outer trees. And that's actually a very funny thing I find. I look at my nieces and nephews now, and I have squillions of them. And I look at them looking at me in the same way that I looked at my uncles and aunts, you know. It might be something as small as me helping them fill out a CAO form, or it might be something, you know, but you know, they look and they assume a wisdom, and the funny thing is, when I'm in these boots, I don't feel particularly wise. I don't feel particularly accomplished or finished. I still think I'm searching and trying to be the person that I'm meant to be. But I just think there is an intergenerational thing that happens. And I suppose for me, and I know it comes to attachment style, or I suppose we are created and molded by the people and the events in our lives. And so therefore, losing a person, to me, is as profound as losing a limb. Or, you know, you lose part of what makes you you. And you now have to adapt and find a new way to be yourself in the absence of that person, even when that person leaves a profound legacy to you.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And it's so true. And I think where we can get really stuck is when we look back and go, what is the world now without them? As opposed to, who do I now have to become now that they're not there? And it's funny, I'm laughing here because we all think we're so unique, and we are so beautiful and unique, but we have such similar thoughts as well. I had a thought today, you know, and I think, like, I'm sure it was triggered by your book. And it's like, when the trees are all gone, like in my case, I've one aunt left on my father's side, but they're all gone. There's no option but to become that tree for the next generation, rather than go, who's going to save me now? It's like, no one's coming, no one is coming. And actually, you've got to turn and look at the little ones and offer them, you know, shelter. And in your case, you know, a fraction of what you were given. In my case, a lot more than what was available to me. But yeah, that's our option is, do I crumble or do I become the tree and pass on that legacy?
I always remember looking at my father and aunt. She used to visit a lot when we were young, and they would be in the kitchen talking, and after a while my father would say, get out now, go out and play outside, get out, go on, we're talking here. And I have such a clear memory of thinking, when I grow up, I'm going to have really important things to talk about all day long. That's how I know when I'm an adult. I'm still waiting. So, you know, I'm waiting for that sense. So I think that's the fallacy, isn't it? That the people we looked at as completed and formed human beings, now we are being looked at in that light. And yet from inside we know, I've got a lot to learn yet. I just hope I have time to learn it all, you know.
I'm still growing up. I'm still trying to figure out this being human thing. And, you know, I think the older I get, I hit 50 in March this year. It's like, it's just not going to happen, Liz, actually. It's just not going to happen. And I think the growing up is actually accepting our humanity and, you know, our weaknesses and our, you know, fallibility and all of that.
I'm laughing because I was 50 a year and a half ago, and actually that's what I'm working on now, is a whole series of poems, which I'm hoping to, I don't know if it'll be a book, but I'm hoping to work with artists, female artists of around the same age, like on this whole thing of, well, I'm 50 now, am I supposed to just die or be old or something like that? Where's my place in the world while I'm still trying to figure things out? So that's why I'm just laughing at you saying exactly what I'm thinking myself, you know. How do we find who we are?
And it's the story through the ages, you know, of youth is wasted on the young, you know. We spend our youth wishing we looked different or were different or were with someone different, and then we finally accept our lot. It's like, God, now I've lost all the youth that I so desperately didn't, rejected for so many decades. But it's almost like there's no way around it but to go through that. And it's like, no matter what we teach, it's like grief. We can't fully understand it until we're sitting there with our belly shaking, or on our knees. It's one of those experiences that is so embodied that unless we're in the body feeling it, it's hard to get our heads around. But I think poetry is such a beautiful way of, giving other people at least a taste of maybe what's to come. And although if maybe some people haven't experienced this yet, they read this book and then go, that's what she meant. Or that's what, that's what that line meant. Now I'm living it. Now I understand. Because you refer to the youths board learning your poems or something. And it's like, it means nothing when it's not in your reality.
Or when you, that's a kind of a laugh. Brendan had he was so delighted when he was his poems were put on the honours course in the Leaving Cert, and if anybody is out there who's had to study his poems, it's worth it. You've no idea how happy you made that man. He was so delighted, but he was delighted, but at the same time he'd always felt that poetry should be something that you can understand without a huge amount of analysis. He didn't want his poetry to be obscure. I don't want my poetry to be obscure, actually. I can't really see the point in writing it unless it can mean something to people, And so he was caught there between that kind of a thing that, yes, his poetry is in the Leaving Cert course, but now people are going to be trying to dissect it and explain it, when all he wanted was people to get it, to feel it,
What do you want for this book, Into the Grey?
This book was very much, this was my thank you, because they couldn't say thank you anymore. So this book was my thank you to the 2 nursing homes. I'm really glad all the publishing costs and everything have been met. So everything, anyone who buys this book now, the whole lot of it is going to the nursing homes, which is, and I think I really wanted, I wanted to do 2 things with this book. One, I wanted the people who looked after John and Brendan, and the people who work in every nursing home, and who actually, it's a hard job. It's a hard job when you're dealing with older people who are not rational or not doing very well and are demanding. It's hard to keep going in there and doing it really well. So I felt that somebody needed to say, you're amazing. If you go in and do that job, this is an amazing job, and it's unseen, and it's I think John McDonough was talking about his kids, talking about how much footballers are paid per week, and he was thinking how much the carers who look after his dad are paid per week. So we have our kind of priorities skewed a bit. I think these people look after the most precious resource that we have, but I think the second thing was that somebody who is living through this, and who is struggling, because, as I say, I spent a lot of time on my knees while this was going on. I think if you read the book, I don't mean to make it seem pretty or beautiful, or it was brutal.
It's real.
It was brutal at times. It was also beautiful, but it was brutal. And I love the idea that if somebody was going through it or had recently gone through it, they would find something, and they would say, somebody out there in the world gets what I was going through.
It's honestly such a gift. And when I sat down just to pick out a few poems this morning that I'd be able to reference with you, I read the entire thing cover to cover. And after I'd read Hindsight, which is the last poem, while you have your thank you there at the end, I immediately flicked to the front. I was like, oh, please, may she have signed it for me, and I was so delighted that it was signed. But it's a book about anticipatory grief. It's a book about dementia. It's a book about ambiguous loss. It's a book about love. It's a book about service. and the, you know, being of service to each other in life. It's absolutely beautiful. And I love the cover, actually, Mary. I wanted to ask you who designed that, and what's to be read from it, or is it up to everyone to
that was
decide for
actually,
themselves?
well, I think everyone can see it as they want to see it, but it was, and I'm very grateful. I have a great team around me.
Yeah.
I have I've had the same graphic designer work on pretty much all of my work, Tom Moore. Rebecca Carl, who I did a book with, my first book was with Rebecca, actually. I've worked with artists on a number of books. And I was talking to her about it, and she had known John and Brendan, and she said, I would really like to do a painting for you. Now, you don't have to use it if you don't want. And while this seems to have all that colour, in fact, she made it using only primary colours to blend grey. And there's you know, the passage of the books, which almost looks like a tomb up above. I mean, books were massive in both John and Brendan's life. There's also a sense to which it's shut, it's stoppered. The little panel underneath it, in fact, means an awful lot to me, because if you look at, you can actually, this white here, they're two figures. Brendan always wore a scarf. He was quite debonair, and if you have a look at one of those two figures, he's got his scarf on. That's Brendan, and John's behind him. And then the lovely thing is the fact that that dark grey, that's a door. There's a doorknob on that if you go looking. So the boys are traveling to somewhere rather than to nowhere. So I just love what she did for me in this. And then the other person who was super was my own editor, whose grandmother, and I didn't know that, but his grandmother had died of dementia, and who was somebody he really loved. And so Dennis Mike Diathis, my editor, and he just got it. You know, he's a great editor, and I know the book is better, actually, because I love writing. I'm incredibly lazy when it comes to editing and rewriting. And he just kept on in my case. Come on, you can do better. You can say this better. And so it helped.
Yeah. And you mentioned him, I think, in the forward. I read that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's, you know, I know a lot of listeners would buy the books when they've listened to a podcast episode. And, you know, maybe you're not caring for someone with dementia or Alzheimer's, but this is a book, you know, that although this is about your uncles and their dementia and you're caring for them, most of us have experienced some sort of disenfranchised grief, some sort of ambiguous loss, or we will, you know, a loss that is not recognized enough by society, or we have relationships that people don't fully understand how much we've lost when that person has died or gone away. And you capture the human condition around loss and grief so very, very beautifully. It moved me to tears for an hour or so. And it certainly brought me right back to what I have lost as well in recent months. There's so much more I wanted to talk to you about, you know, COVID and the phone and letting all the relatives say goodbye. And there's just so much in this book. I will definitely read it again. And I'm sure I'll use it in my teachings. I teach, you know, the Irish Hospice Foundation and a few other organisations.
Absolutely, so feel free.
Yeah.
What I might do is I might send you the link. If anybody is interested in buying it, they can buy it directly from the nursing homes, which I would really like, because then the nursing homes get all of the money.
Yeah.
So Oris Vera have it on their website, and they have a link. It's just like buying it from Amazon or whatever.
Yeah.
And you can buy it directly. If they want to write and if they want it signed, I'll come and scroll it for them. And I might send you the link for that, or they can just Oris Vera Nursing Home, they'll find it.
They mightn't, because there's a lot of international listeners. So so I go to the podcast description, either on shapesofgrief.com or on Anchor, on Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. I will have a link to where you can buy that book, and let's definitely buy it direct from the nursing homes, everybody. It's really beautiful. Do you know what is so lovely about this? You can read it in an hour. Maybe not to be recommended, more about like picking it up, reading a couple, putting it down. But it's the first book I've read cover to cover in quite a while. So there was a lovely sense of accomplishment as well. And always, always lovely to just, you know, be touched and have emotions stirred and to be alive again and remembering love and loss. So thank you for that, Mary.
Thank you so much, Liz.
Yeah, look, it's been an absolutely gorgeous conversation. Thanks so much for coming on to Shapes of Grief.
Lovely to meet you.
Yeah, good luck with it.
All right, thank you so much.
Take care, Mary. Bye.